Welcome to Mrs. True Crime. Today's video is an in-depth look into serial rapist Edward Paisnel. It's a tale of fear and torment. If you're triggered by anything dealing with rape and or harm to children, feel free to click off this video. Perhaps check out a Lion's video for some lighthearted content. If not, I'm Nicole. Let's get started. You're in your room trying to fall asleep. Your thoughts swirl to the day's events, engulfing you in a world of laughter and adventure. The floor squeaks, but you pay it no mind. A few seconds pass and the floor makes another sound. You open your eyes to a darkened room. You squint, trying to focus, but fail. You return to your pillow and thoughts, unnoticing the tall figure lurking near your bed. The figure grows closer, so close that you can feel its breath on your neck. You wake to face it. Its piercing eyes are staring back at you. Its face looks like it's peeling off. There are spikes around its wrists and it's dressed in a long cloak. You can't scream. You can't even think. You've never seen anyone like it, and you never will again. It holds a noose for you, but it doesn't want to kill you. No, it wants to play with you. It sneaks you out of the house and takes you to a field, and it's in that field that your innocence is stripped away from you, and all you can remember are those piercing eyes. You were 12 years old, and the first child victim of the Beast of Jersey. Located in the Bay of St. Malo, in between France and England, sits the island of Jersey, the biggest of the Channel Islands. It is 5 miles long and 9 miles wide, with approximately 100,000 people inhabiting it. The island birthed notable names as actor Henry Cavill and artist Edmund Blampede, but the name that no one can forget is the one that carried on throughout the fields of the Isle for 11 years. It crept into homes and sexually assaulted and raped countless women and children. It terrorized the people for years and drove a citizen to exile. The name was Edward Paisnel. Edward John Louis Paisnel was born in 1925 to Emile Paisnel and his wife, the oldest and affluent family on the island. He grew into a building contractor with one arrest under his belt. From 1940 to 1945, Jersey became the only British island to be under German control in World War II. Their 5-year run on the Isle ceased outside communication from citizens, increased petrol shortages, and almost eliminated food and medical supplies. Edward took it upon himself to steal the food he could and distribute to starving families. He was then jailed for a month. His empathy and gentle nature allowed him to roam the streets of Jersey freely as a well-known and well-liked individual, but it was all a facade. Hidden underneath his compassion was a growing darkness that would soon be unleashed. In November 1957, in the cool evening air, an unnamed 29-year-old nurse waited for a bus. She didn't notice the man dressed in a long coat with a dark cap pulled near his eyes staring at her. He waited. For how long, it's unknown, but he examined his options before dragging her into the nearby field and sexually assaulting her. The attack was so aggressive that it left the nurse severely injured and requiring stitches. He attacked twice more the following year in March and July, attacking a 20-year-old and 31-year-old woman respectively waiting for a bus. For both attacks, he added a new element, a noose. He'd apply the rope around the women's necks and drag them to a field where he'd sexually assault them. For a short few months, the attacks ceased as Edward met and married Joan Walden in 1959, but the marriage was more of a contract than a devotion to love. They kept up appearances, had a daughter, and raised 2 stepchildren, but behind closed doors, they lived apart. Edward built an annex into the house the two shared, consisting of an office and a large sitting room, and lived there. The couple, it seemed, lived their own lives, with Edward allegedly having a mistress speculated to be nurse Florence Ashcroft Hawkins. Hawkins was described as a spinster who told The Guardian that her and Edward often spent weekends together. But the quiet routine of wife, mistress, and child only delayed Edward's drive for sexual aggression. Months after tying the knot, he struck again. His fourth attack occurred in August against a 15-year-old girl walking home. Next, in October, he attempted the same on a 28-year-old woman, but she fought him off and fled. Word was now spreading around the Isle of a vicious rapist lying in wait. Police pieced together a profile based on victim descriptions. According to the victims, the man was early to mid-40s, 5'6", and had an Irish accent. He wore a rope or cord around his waist, often restrained victims by tying their hands together, and reportedly smelled musty. While the description vaguely resembled Edward, as well as others on the Isle, he strived to distance himself from suspicion. According to an essay entitled Tranquility, Violence, and Sexuality, an Exploration of Connections, Edward was very intense about his personal hygiene, reportedly washing with an antiseptic soap. He also showed great aggression towards the island rapist, proclaiming that if he caught the criminal, he would castrate him. His temperament blended with the residents, and no one paid him any mind. That is, except for the children. Joan often worked at La Preference, a children's foster home owned by her mother. Edward would sometimes visit working as a handyman, nicknamed Uncle Ted, and gave sweets and gifts to the children. He sat them on his lap and dressed as Santa Claus every year before sexually assaulting them. A witness, only known as 205, wrote in an inquest that she didn't tell anyone of the assault because she feared no one would believe her. Another witness, named only Mr. D, described how Edward would crawl through the darkened hallways in a mask and watch the children sleep. Quote, "Up on the top dormitories, there's an area of cubby holes, and it was wide enough to walk right round all the bedrooms. The landing had a flickering light all the time, and he used to see these eyes appear on the top of the landing even though it was pitch black. I'm sure whoever was doing it was going in one of these cubby holes, crawling around there in the room, and this went on quite regularly. I saw this face staring at me, and I now think it was Edward Paisnel." Unquote. It's unclear why Edward began to change his modus operandi, but starting in 1960, he began to attack citizens indoors, more specifically, children. In the early hours of February 14, 1960, Edward crept into the home of a 12-year-old boy through his bedroom window. He awoke to a rope being placed around his neck and was then led outside where he was assaulted in a field. The following month, a mother was awoken by a telephone ringing on the bottom floor of her cottage at 12:30 a.m. She went down to answer it, but was greeted with a dial tone. She returned to bed, only to be reawakened an hour later by a sound downstairs. She switched on the lights and descended down the stairs, but as she reached the bottom, the lights flickered out. Quote, "I heard somebody in the living room. A man appeared and grabbed me." Unquote. He demanded money, then tied her hands together. Her 14-year-old daughter heard the commotion and appeared out of her room. Her mother screamed to warn her, but her daughter ventured downstairs anyway. The mother struggled free and ran to get help. When she returned, her daughter, crying, told her she'd been raped. The next month, a 14-year-old girl was awakened in her bedroom to find Edward wearing a strange mask. She screamed and he fled. His final attack of the year was in July on an 8-year-old boy who he sexually assaulted in a field and promptly left on his doorstep. In 1961, Edward attacked 3 times. In February, on a 12-year-old boy who reportedly wasn't harmed. In March, on an 11-year-old boy who screamed as the noose was being tightened around his neck, causing Edward to flee. And in April, on an 11-year-old girl. At this point, there had been 11 attacks on both women and children, and police were at their wits' end. No one matched the description of the masked attacker, except one, agriculture worker and fisherman Alphonse Legastois. Alphonse lived a quiet life alone in Jersey, regularly roaming the countryside late into the evening. He was described as eccentric and was often teased by youngsters in the parish of St. Martin, but his quiet lifestyle and free-spirit personality placed him at the top of the suspect list. He was arrested and questioned about his involvement, but released after 14 to 40 hours of interrogation. Unfortunately, his nightmare was just starting. While questioned, police searched his cottage and removed his clothing for examination. When he returned home, all his windows were broken. His name was then released to the press, which only fueled the frightened citizens into a frenzy. He was, quote, hounded, humiliated, spat on, and cursed, unquote. His cottage was burnt down, and his life was threatened. Fearing for his safety, he left Jersey in May 1961 for Écrahos, a reef between Jersey and France, and remained there for 14 years. With Alphonse's departure, citizens only assumed that the attacks would end, but they were wrong. Detectives acquired the help of Scotland Yard Detective Superintendent Jack Mannings, who enlisted the help of the citizens. They were tasked with reporting anyone that fit the identikit of who the police were calling the Beast. The profile was as follows. He, quote, always struck at night, on moonlit weekends between the hours of 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. He appeared to have an intimate knowledge of the island, particularly the eastern areas. He was described as being about 40 to 45 years old, about 5'6", with a mustache and a medium build, wearing a low, thigh-length jacket or raincoat which gave off a distinct musty smell, a peaked cap, and gloves. His face was always covered, either with a face mask or a scarf covering the lower part of it, unquote. He selected his victims carefully and usually entered through the bedroom window. Once inside, he tied his victims' hands and placed a rope around their necks, taking them to a nearby field and performing sexual acts. Once finished, he would return them home. He spoke a lot during the attacks in a soft Irish accent. He mentioned a wife, a dead mother, and that he murdered before. He also often spoke of dropping either a lighter or a cigarette behind. Edward was meticulous, leaving breadcrumbs to a man that didn't exist, and it left the detectives stumped, so stumped that Edward went on with his crimes. In either April 1962 or 63, he attacked a 9-year-old boy. In November 1963, it was an 11-year-old boy. In July 1964, it was a 10-year-old girl, and in August, a 16-year-old boy. For whatever reason, Edward went quiet for 2 years, then reemerged through a letter to police. It read, quote, "My dear sir, I think that it is just the time to tell you that you are just wasting your time, as every time I have done what I always intended to do, and remember, it will not stop at this, but I will be fair to you and give you a chance. I have never had much out of this life, but I intend to get everything I can now. I have always wanted to do the perfect crime. I have done this, but this time let the moon shine very bright in September, because this time it must be perfect. Not one, but two. I am not a maniac by a long shot, but I like to play with you people. You will hear from me before September, and I will give you all the clues, just to see if you can catch me. Yours very sincerely, wait and see." Unquote. In August 1966, a 15-year-old girl was raped. The Beast kept his word, though there was a difference. A clue, as the letter speaks of. The young girl had long, regularly spaced parallel scratches on her torso. This attack rose questions that would settle with the police for 4 years, until the Beast attacked again. Edward's last and final attack occurred on August 1970, when a 13-year-old awoke to a bright light in his face. He was taken from his bed and sexually assaulted in Edward's usual fashion, then returned home. The boy was threatened into silence, but his fear and paranoia of the man returning sparked him to speak. He described the Beast, but there was a change. He wore a mask and had black spiky hair. The boy's body sported the same scratches in the 1966 attack. It was now over a decade, and it didn't appear that Edward would ever be caught. That is, until one little red light. Officers John Riseborough and Tom McGinn were on patrol around St. Helier on July 17, 1971 at 11:45 p.m. when a stolen Morris 11,000 saloon car ran a red light at high speed. The car bypassed a police roadblock. The officers pursued, but the driver was not making it easy. It sideswiped several cars and drove on the wrong side of the road. It sped down footpaths until crashing through a hedge and halting into a tomato field. The driver got out of the car and began to run. The officers followed, leaving their vehicle until one of them tackled the reckless driver to the ground. He was taken to the police station. But once there, detectives realized this was more than just a routine arrest. The man wore a long overcoat with inch-long nails in the lapels and shoulders. His wrists were clad with nail-studded bracelets, old trousers tucked into his socks, carpet slippers, woolen gloves, and inside the lining of his coat was a rubber mask. When inquired about his apparel, Edward simply explained that he was attending an orgy and borrowed the car to avoid being seen. He further claimed that the nails in his clothing were defenses against anyone who attacked him. As for the mask and wig, well, they were just accessories used in a secret society he belonged to. The secret society were an elite group of Satanists, according to Edward. Detectives searched his home and discovered a shrine to Satan hidden behind red curtains. The shrine consisted of a large altar with occult symbols and a large knife hanging over a glass chalice. There was also a porcelain toad, old clothing, homemade wigs and hats, false eyebrows, a camera, and several photos of various homes. Black magic paraphernalia lined the altar. Edward admitted to a fascination with the dark arts and proclaimed that Gel de Ra was his ancestor and inspiration. To put it simply, Gel was a French soldier who admitted to the kidnapping and torture of 200 children. He was sentenced to death in October 1440. Besides the evidence collected from Edward's car and home, he refused to supply any further information about his crimes. Not that it was needed. The shrine in his home helped paint a story for detectives. Edward stalked his victims for some time, explaining why his attack gap was so inconsistent. He photographed their homes and watched their movements prior to striking. Detective Inspector George Shelter discovered footprints overlooking a bedroom of a victim. The Guardian writes, quote, "He said the footprints indicated that a man has spent long vigils watching through the window of the child's room," unquote. The footprints were also found during the August 1966 attack on a 10-year-old girl, an attack that Edward's father Emil claimed was not his son. Emil claims on the night of the attack, Edward was at his home watching TV. Florence Hawkins' assumed mistress also claimed that Edward was at her house sleeping during a 1970 attack on an 11-year-old boy. Truthfully, I don't know if these attacks can be contributed to Edward or not. While he did attack children in 1966 and 1970, information differs and shifts. He may have attacked more than one child those years, or there may have been another rapist on the aisle. One newspaper said he only attacked 4 children. An article rose the number to 6, while the book places attacks at roughly 22. However, abuse allegations concerning foster home Haute de la Grande have come to light since 2008, and though Edward's involvement has been disputed, it doesn't negate that abuse did occur and is not only staff-related. In any case, after a 5-day trial and 45 minutes of deliberation, a guilty verdict was read on November 29, 1971. Edward was charged with 13 counts of assault, rape, and sodomy and sentenced to 30 years in prison. He appealed in 1972, but was rejected. During his prison stay, he married Florence Hawkins in 1989. 3 years later, he was released for good behavior, but exiled to Isle of Wight, where he died of a heart attack in 1994. In 1975, Alphonse returned to Jersey after being accused of arson. Though he was acquitted, he felt unwanted by the Reef and remained in Jersey. In 1999, politician John Rothwell asked the states of Jersey to offer £20,000, roughly $25,000, in compensation, stating that the state had a responsibility to recognize the mental pain and suffering the citizens cast. While the committee stated its sympathy for Alphonse, it, quote, believed it for the states to make such a payment on account of the treatment which Mr. Legastois received from individuals for which no public body was responsible could establish a precedent in the eyes of all who believed they suffered injustice, with unquantifiable financial consequences, unquote. In short, his compensation was rejected. For the remainder of his life, he lived in a small, damp house owned by the government in poverty. He died June 2012 at the age of 97. Edward Paisnel was the guy next door, the unseeming, compassionate contractor, yet he crept into homes and stole the innocence and stripped the safety away from children and women alike. Not only that, but he tarnished the life of a blameless man who died without receiving so much as an apology. The saddest truth, I think, is that the children involved were scared to speak up. They felt as if no one would believe them. According to Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, RAINN.org, it was discovered that between 2009 to 2013, 63,000 children a year were victims of sexual abuse. HuffPost.com states that 20% of girls and 8% of boys will be sexually abused before they're 18, and that the most vulnerable age is between 3 to 8. The worst case evidence found was that according to Australian Childhood Foundation, 33% of adults don't believe children when they state they've been abused. Survivors of childhood abuse are 10 to 13 times more likely to commit suicide, about 3 times more likely to suffer from major depression, and about 4 times more likely to develop symptoms of drug abuse and experience PTSD as adults. It is so important that we as adults listen to our children. We may be amazed at what they have to say. I'm Mr. True Crime, and remember to be kind, be loud, be aware. For more information about Edward Paisnel, why not check out some of these awesome links. And if you like what you saw and heard today, why not drop a like and a comment. Maybe subscribe while you're here. I make new videos every Wednesday, and you don't want to miss what's in store.